The summer the assessor came to put a value on Delia Marsh's inheritance, he stood in the gravel drive of her late father's property for 11 minutes before he wrote anything down at all. And when he finally pressed his pen to the clipboard, he shook his head, the way a man shakes his head, at a dog sleeping in a mud puddle, with a pity so reflexive it costs him nothing. He appraised the half-acre lot on County Road 9 at $42,000, the cinderblock shop building at $8,000, and the contents of that shop at a number so small Delia would later say she had trouble recalling it because it barely registered as a number at all. $250 for every tool, every shelf, every dusty glass jar her father Harold had ever touched. The assessor did not open the locked room at the back of the shop. He looked at the padlock, tugged it once, noted it as storage, and moved on. That was in early June. By the following August, 63 families in the valley would be in front of her, hats in hand, asking for something no amount of money could easily replace. Whether she gave it to them, and on what terms, is a matter the valley still argues about at diners and at the edges of parking lots after church. But the real verdict had already been rendered. The land rendered it. The locked room rendered it. Harold Marsh rendered it, from wherever the dead go to watch the living stumble toward sense. Delia had come back to Hatchet Creek with $8,100, a duffel bag, a truck that was legally hers only because her ex-husband Calvin Poole had signed it over to avoid a second court date and a credit score that looked like a winter forecast. The house she had shared with Calvin for 9 years was gone, legally transferred as part of the settlement, though settlement was a word that required some charity, because what had been settled primarily was that she would walk away from most of it in exchange for walking away cleanly. She was 38 years old. She had not lived in Hatchet Creek in 16 years, and the people who knew her at all remembered her as Harold's quiet daughter who left for the city and married somebody unsuitable. The people who did not know her simply saw a woman arriving alone with boxes and a duffel bag and assumed some version of the same story. She heard the words starting over twice in her first week, each time from someone who meant well, and each time with an inflection that assigned her firmly to the category of things that had failed. Her father's estate, such as it was, came to her through a will that a lawyer named Greer Pattinson had filed 3 years before Harold died, on a day when Harold had apparently been clear-eyed enough to insist on it and stubborn enough to pay Pattinson in cash from a coffee can rather than accept any kind of installment arrangement. The will left Delia the lot, the shop, the small frame house adjacent to it, and everything Harold owned, which Pattinson described as of modest but real value to someone who understood it, a qualifier that had puzzled Delia at the time and that she had not thought about again until she was standing inside the shop for the first time in 11 years, breathing the smell of her father's life, which was machine oil and dry wood and something underneath both of those things she could not name but recognized in her chest, before she recognized it anywhere else. The shop was 40 feet by 30 feet of cinder block and corrugated metal roof, with a workbench along the north wall, pegboard holding tools and outlines Harold had traced in black marker, so every tool had a shadow of itself to return to. There were shelves of small glass jars holding hardware sorted by size, and a window on the south side so dirty it passed light the color of weak tea. And at the back of the shop, behind a tall shelving unit stocked with canning supplies and old paint cans, there was a door, a plain wooden door with a deadbolt and a padlock on a hasp, both locked. Delia had no key for either. She stood in front of it for a while, then went back to the house and started cleaning. She found the key on the 4th day inside an empty Maxwell House coffee can on the second shelf of the kitchen pantry, wedged between the can's inner wall and a folded piece of paper on which Harold had written in his careful block letters, "For Delia when she's ready." She had to sit down after that. She sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes without moving, and then she went to the shop with both keys and opened the door. What Harold Marsh had been keeping in that locked room was a seed library, not a decorative collection, not a hobby. A working seed library of a kind that almost nobody in Hatchet Creek in the 21st century would have known how to describe or evaluate, but that someone who did understand seeds would have recognized immediately as something built with the patience of a person who understood that the future is not given but preserved. Floor-to-ceiling wooden shelving on 3 walls, hundreds of small glass jars sealed with rubber gaskets and labeled in Harold's block print, each label carrying a name, a year, a note of 2 or 3 words. Cherokee Purple, 2009, excellent dry season. Mortgage Lifter, 2014 heavy set. Lemon Drop, 2003, saved from Ruth's Garden. Tennessee Greasy, 2011, last of Ruth's beans. There were envelopes in labeled drawers, seed packets in small paper bags, twisted shut, varieties of tomatoes and beans and squash and peppers and melons and greens representing decades of saving, the oldest dated 1987. Harold had been doing this for 35 years. He had never mentioned it to a soul, as far as Delia could determine, and the assessor had stood on the other side of that door and written it down as storage. The note inside the coffee can said only, "These are worth more than the numbers say. Listen to what they've been keeping." It said it the way Harold said everything important, which was quietly and only once. Delia understood imperfectly at first that she had inherited something rare. What she did not yet understand was how rare, or what the valley would eventually need it to be. That understanding came in pieces, the way real understandings do, slower than crisis and faster than comfort. She had $8,000 left after paying first month on the utilities and buying food for 30 days, and replacing the hot water heater, which had failed in the way old hot water heaters fail, which is to say, completely and without negotiation. $8,000 was 4 months of careful living, maybe 5 if she grew food, which she intended to do. She had the shop, which was sound, but generated nothing. She had the house, which was hers outright under the will, and could not be touched by the settlement, because Calvin's lawyer had not known about it until after the documents were signed, and by then the only thing Calvin's lawyer could do was complain, which he did, in a letter Delia read once and then used to level a wobbly table leg. She had the locked room, now unlocked, and 312 distinct varieties of seed in various quantities, and she had her father's 35 years of notes in a series of composition notebooks stacked on the bottom shelf, which she began reading the night she found them and did not stop reading, in aggregate, for weeks. The first person who came to the shop in an official capacity after the assessor was a man named Broderick Fain, who represented something called the Valley Agricultural Consolidation Partnership, which was the name a consortium of 4 commercial farming operations had given to their shared legal and acquisitions entity. Fain was 44 years old, wore clean boots and a good jacket, and shook Delia's hand with the warmth of someone who has practiced warmth as a technique rather than discovered it as a reflex. He told her he had been meaning to stop by since she arrived, and that the partnership was always interested in supporting legacy landholders in the area, and that he admired her coming back to take care of Harold's place, which was a real commitment, especially for a woman managing it alone. He said woman managing it alone the way someone says a thing they consider accurate and informative rather than revealing. Delia thanked him for stopping by. He told her before he left that if the property ever felt like more than she could handle, the partnership would be glad to make things easier for her. He named a number, $62,000 for the lot, and both buildings, including contents. He said contents with a slight pause after it, and his eyes went briefly to the back of the shop where the shelving unit stood in front of the locked door, and Delia noticed the pause and filed it away, the way her father had filed hardware, by size and type, labeled in a place she would not lose it. She thanked him again and did not accept or decline. He left a card. She set it on the shelf next to Harold's notebooks. The town's opinion of Delia Marsh was formed and distributed mostly at Holt's Hardware, which had a back room where a coffee urn ran all day, and at the Kessler family diner, where the booths filled at 6 in the morning, and the conversation did not much vary. What the town had concluded by mid-July was that Harold's girl had come back broke, and maybe a little broken, that she was camping in that old house with no real plan, and that it was a sadness because Harold had been well regarded, and the property deserved someone who could actually work it. There was also a minority opinion held by 2 or 3 people, and never expressed very loudly, that Harold had always been peculiar about that shop, and that Delia had gotten some kind of peculiar inheritance to go with the peculiarity. But this opinion did not find much purchase because nobody could say what they meant by it specifically, and vague opinions in small towns require a specific wound to grow on, and there was no specific wound yet. On a Tuesday in mid-July, Delia drove to the Grange supply store for potting mix and a set of seed trays, which was a modest purchase, the kind of purchase that announced nothing, and the man behind the counter, whose name she did not know, and who did not know hers, asked if she was starting a garden. And when she said yes, he told her it was late in the season for starting, and when she said she was starting with what she had, he nodded in the way. People nod when they have already stopped listening, and she paid and left. On the drive home she did the arithmetic in her head, not because she did not know it already, but because doing it aloud in her own mind had become a kind of discipline. 312 varieties, several hundred seeds per variety in most cases, 1 season to evaluate germination and vitality, 2 seasons to meaningfully multiply. The arithmetic of seeds was not like the arithmetic of money, which ran in one direction and required spending to prove it. The arithmetic of seeds ran forward and backward simultaneously, and if you were patient, it multiplied without being spent, which was the thing about it that Calvin and Calvin's way of thinking could never have grasped, and that Harold had apparently grasped completely. The elder who appeared at the edge of her garden in the 3rd week of July was a woman named Vera Cholodenko, who was 77 years old, Ukrainian by birth, and who had lived on the adjacent property for 22 years in a small greenhouse her husband Mikhail had built before he died. Vera kept a kitchen garden of legendary productivity and a reputation in the valley for knowing things about soil that soil science departments did not know, which was the kind of reputation that is bestowed on immigrant women by communities that are simultaneously grateful for the knowledge and a little embarrassed to attribute it to anything they can name. Vera came to the fence and watched Delia transplanting seedlings for a few minutes without speaking. Delia looked up and nodded. Vera nodded back. What Vera said eventually was this: "My grandmother kept seeds the same way, in Ukraine, from the collectivization through everything that came after." She said the seeds do not know about history. They only know about the gardener's intention. She said, "Your father was a man of intention. I watched him through this fence for 20 years. Then she said, "I can see you are also a woman of intention, but you are guessing. Come and I will show you what your father already figured out, because I think you have not read to the back of his notebooks yet." Delia had not. She was on notebook 4 of 11. What the back of the 11th notebook contained was Harold's soil notes, his germination tables, sorted by microclimate, and a section titled simply "The Locked Room Protocol," which laid out in careful order the varieties Harold had identified as specifically adapted to low moisture conditions, to the particular clay-heavy soil of the Hatchet Creek Valley, to late frosts and early bests. He had been selecting for drought tolerance for 15 years without calling it that, because Harold had not needed a scientific term for a thing he could observe with his own eyes. He had watched the valley dry out in stages over 2 decades, had watched the aquifer drop, had watched the commercial farms drill deeper and deeper, and had saved seeds from the plants that did not care, from the beans that set pods when the sky was copper and the creek ran thin, from the tomatoes that ripened hard and flavorful when other tomatoes dropped their blossoms in the heat. He had been building, in the language of seeds, a library of persistence. Vera sat with Delia in the shop for 4 hours on that first afternoon and for many hours across the following weeks, and what she taught Delia was not any single technique, but a way of paying attention that had a different texture than the paying attention Delia had done before. She said, "The seed is not the thing that grows, it is the memory of the thing that survived. You are not a farmer keeping seeds. You are a librarian keeping memories of survival." She said it in accented, deliberate English, the way she said everything, as if she were translating not just from Ukrainian, but from a slower and more serious world. And Delia wrote it in the margin of Notebook 11 and underlined it twice. The seed is not the thing that grows, it is the memory of the thing that survived. This became, in Delia's understanding, both the purpose of the locked room and the principle by which she would run it. You did not sell memories of survival. You kept them and you multiplied them, and when survival was needed, you made them available, and the terms of that availability were determined by whether the person asking had anything to offer the memory's continuation, which was not always money, and was sometimes labor, and was sometimes nothing more than the intention to plant and save and return. In August, a boy named Pell Dutcher began appearing at the garden fence. He was 9 years old, the son of a family that rented a house on the far side of the creek, and he had the watchful, economical quality of a child who has learned that quiet costs less than noise. He did not ask to help, he watched. After 4 or 5 visits, he simply began helping, carrying things, filling the watering can, crouching to look at seedlings with an attention that was genuine and a little startling in a 9-year-old. He named the plants as if they were animals, gave the vigorous ones approving nods, spoke to the failing ones in a tone that Delia recognized from Harold's notebooks as the exact right register, which was not sympathy, but instruction. One afternoon he told her that the mortgage lifter by the south fence was thirsty on one side. She looked, and he was right. She asked how he knew, and he said the leaves are asking. She did not argue with the epistemology. Pell Dutcher became a fixture of the garden and eventually of the shop, where he organized Harold's jars by the date on the label without being asked, and where he developed a serious and personal attachment to a clay-colored jar labeled Red Calypso 2006 Finest Dry Year Bean I Ever Grew, which he carried to show Delia with the care of someone transporting something fragile and important. He told her his grandmother had grown a bean like that. Delia asked where his grandmother lived. He said she used to live here. She died when I was 5. Delia opened the jar and let him look at the beans, small and mottled, and smelling of dry wood and thyme. And Pell Dutcher did not say anything else for a while, and Delia thought that was correct. Broderick Fane came back in September with a second offer, $69,000 this time, and a different energy, less warmth, and more efficiency, as if the courtesy budget had been adjusted. He mentioned that the partnership had acquired the Delray parcel to the north and the 2 Simpkins plots on the east side, which meant the Marsh property was now, in his phrase, adjacent to partnership land on 3 sides, which he presented as a fact of geography rather than a pressure, but which was both. He said he understood the property had sentimental value, and that the partnership was prepared to honor that. He said Delia could think of it not as a sale, but as a transition to stewardship, which was a phrase that required a moment to understand, and then, once understood, required a longer moment to not respond to sharply. Delia said she appreciated him coming by. He left. The card went next to the first card on the shelf. The drought arrived in the first week of October, with no ceremony and considerable effect. It was not a drought that announced itself as a historic event immediately, because droughts in the valley had been becoming routine for long enough that people waited to see if it would break before they called it a drought rather than a dry spell. But this one did not break. It tightened. By November, the creek was running at less than a third of normal volume. By December, the commercial wells on the partnership's north parcels were drawing water, heavy with mineral sediment, which was a sign the aquifer was being drawn down faster than it recharged. The valley went into the new year dry and anxious, and by February it was clear that the spring planting would be a gamble because the seed supply in most operations was the standard commercial variety, hybrid and high input, bred for consistent conditions and demanding of the irrigation that the aquifer could no longer reliably support. Delia had spent the fall multiplying. She had planted 40% of Harold's drought-adapted varieties in the test beds Vera helped her lay out along the south-facing slope behind the shop, had harvested, had cleaned and dried and added to the library, had made detailed notes in a new composition notebook she had started after finishing Harold's last one. The library was growing. The germination rates on Harold's oldest seeds were better than she had any right to expect, because Harold had understood dry storage and cold and had kept the room at a temperature and humidity that preserved viability, and she maintained those conditions from the notes he had left. She had sold in October 2 small lots of seed to a man named Desjardins, who drove up from a county to the south and who ran a small heirloom operation, and who recognized, when he opened the jars Delia brought to show him, that he was looking at something assembled over a long time with serious purpose. He paid her $420 for 2 varieties, which was not a transformative sum, but which was specific and real, and which she recorded in the margin of her new notebook next to the arithmetic. $420 in return for 12 ounces of seed representing Harold Marsh's 40-year investment of observation and intention. The numbers do not know what they are describing. Desjardins told her, before he left, that he had not seen a dry-adapted pole bean selection like the one she had shown him in any catalog or database he knew of. He said if she ever wanted to discuss a larger arrangement, he would be seriously interested. She thanked him and noted his number. She did not call it immediately. She let it sit under the ash, banked, available. In February, Broderick Fane came a 3rd time, and this time there were 2 other men with him, one of whom was introduced as a legal consultant and one of whom was introduced as a water rights specialist, and the offer was $81,000 plus a right of first refusal on any water access discovered on the property, which was a clause so specific in its language about undiscovered water access that it required Delia to stand for a moment and look at Fane in a way she had not looked at him before. She asked him what he knew about water on this property. He said it was a standard clause the partnership used on all valley acquisitions. She said the assessor's report on the property had not included any evaluation of subsurface water. He agreed that was correct. She asked how a water rights clause could be standard for a property no one had assessed for water. He said it was simply a precautionary measure. She thanked him again and did not sign anything, and they left. And she stood in the shop for a long time after that, thinking about what was under the south slope where the test beds were producing in conditions that by rights should have been harder than they were. She called Desjardins that evening. She asked if he knew anyone who read terrain for water. He said he did, and he would give her the name. The name led to a woman named Alvarado, who worked out of a university extension program, and who came in March, and who spent 2 days walking the property and taking measurements, and who told Delia, in a phone call 3 weeks later, that there was a perched water table under the south slope, not large but real, sitting on a layer of impermeable clay at a depth of about 32 feet, and that it was being recharged from a catchment area in the hillside to the west that was not part of any of the partnership's parcels, which meant it was not connected to the aquifer they were drawing down. It was, in hydrological terms, a separate and undisturbed system. It was also because Harold had built the test beds on the south slope, without apparently knowing precisely why that slope worked better, exactly what was feeding the soil that was producing Delia's seeds in a dry year. Harold had not known about the perched water table, but he had known about the slope. He had known the slope worked. He had noted it in 2008. South beds keep going when everything else quits. Don't know what to make of it. Keep planting here. 35 years of observation had located a thing that a hydrogeological assessment confirmed only after the fact. This was the folk wisdom and the soil science, arriving at the same coordinate from different directions, and Delia wrote it in the notebook and then sat with it quietly for the rest of the evening, not triumphant but steady, the way her father had been steady, in the way of people who have been paying attention long enough to recognize when the attention pays. She said nothing to anyone about the perched water table except Vera, who heard it and nodded and said, "Yes, I always thought something was there. The beds on that slope, they never looked thirsty." She said, "Your father knew the land was holding something. That is what he meant when he told me once that the ground here keeps a secret the way old women keep a secret, which is to say, faithfully and for a long time, and only for the right person." Delia wrote that in the margin too. By April, the valley was in open distress. 3 operations had failed their spring planting entirely because their hybrid seed stock had performed poorly under moisture stress, germinating unevenly and setting weakly. The partnership's consolidated fields were running on pumped water at a cost that was making the economics public and ugly, because the partnership had leveraged its acquisitions on the assumption of normal aquifer recharge, and normal aquifer recharge had not occurred. The valley's small operators, the ones who had not sold to the partnership, were in a different but equally serious position, because their seed supply ran through the same commercial distributors the larger operations used, and the distributors were short on everything as drought conditions extended across multiple regions simultaneously. A bag of decent, open-pollinated tomato seed was, by April, nearly impossible to source at any price a small operator could afford. Delia had seed. She had 2 full seasons of multiplication behind Harold's best drought-adapted varieties. She had the perched water table feeding the south beds. She had Vera's instruction, and Harold's notebooks, and Pell Dutcher's reliable labor, and an inventory that had grown from Harold's original 312 varieties to 407, with quantities sufficient, in the case of the 40 most important dryland types, to plant and replant a considerable amount of ground. She had been quiet about it. She had not advertised, had not gone to the Grange meetings, had not spoken at the town hall sessions about the drought response that were held in March and attended by representatives of the county extension office and, notably, by Broderick Fane. She had been banking it like her father had banked the slope, using it without announcing it, keeping the coal low under the ash. The first person who came to her outside the channel of commerce was Mel Hooper, who had farmed the same 43 acres on Crestline Road for 29 years, and who had, at the Grange auction the previous summer, made the loudest and most detailed series of remarks about Harold's peculiar daughter buying a cinder-block shop and thinking she could make something of it, remarks Delia had been informed of by Pell Dutcher, who had heard them from his father. Mel Hooper came to her door on a Wednesday morning in the 2nd week of April, with his cap in his hands, literally in his hands, turning it by the brim, and told her he had heard she might have some seed stock that would stand up in dry conditions, and asked if she had anything for pole beans and summer squash. He told her his supplier had come up empty. He told her he understood if the price was whatever it was. He was talking fast, which was not how he normally talked, and looking at the door of the house rather than at her face. Delia stood on the porch for a moment and looked at Mel Hooper with his cap in his hands and thought about what her father would do, which she knew without having to construct it, because Harold had been a specific and consistent person, and what Harold would do was exactly what she did, which was to tell Mel Hooper to come around to the shop and she would show him what she had, and to not worry about the price yet, because the price was a conversation for after he understood what he was looking at. She showed him the library. Mel Hooper stood in the locked room, which was unlocked now, and looked at 3 walls of labeled jars and drawers and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Harold did all this. It was not a question." She said Harold did all this. He said it quietly, and then he put his cap back on, and then he took it off again. The price she named for seed sufficient to plant his bean and squash acreage was $240, which was approximately what the commercial supply would have cost him in a normal year, and which was approximately 1/8 of what a specialty seed operation would have charged for equivalent drought-adapted open-pollinated varieties in a scarcity year. She told him there was one condition, which was that at the end of the season he would save and return to her a portion of the seed from his best-performing plants, because the library ran on return, not just on sale. And if he was going to benefit from what Harold had built, he was going to help build it forward. Mel Hooper agreed to this immediately in a way that suggested he would have agreed to considerably more if she had asked. This arrangement, which she repeated in various forms over the following 6 weeks with 11 more farmers, was not a secret that held. By the end of April, it was the only conversation at Holt's Hardware, and most of those conversations were not mocking. Broderick Fane came for the 4th time on a Tuesday in early May. He came alone, which was different. He came without the warmth, which had apparently run out, and what replaced it was a directness that was less comfortable, but at least more honest. He told her the partnership needed seed stock suitable for dryland conditions in the valley, that it was willing to pay a market rate, and that the market rate for what she had in that room was something he could make substantially better than what she was charging local farmers. He said $180,000 for exclusive commercial rights to the library, which would remain in situ and which the partnership would manage in perpetuity. He said it was the most he could authorize and that he thought she knew it was fair. He said, "I know what you have in there, Delia." He said her first name, the way someone uses a first name to imply familiarity where familiarity is not present, as a technique. He said, "You can't multiply it fast enough alone. You need distribution and capital. Let us do what we do so you can do what you do." Delia asked him how he knew what she had in there. He said he had been in conversation with county extension staff and that the word was out. She asked if the county extension conversations had included anything specific about the perched water table on the south slope. He said that was a separate matter and one the partnership was well positioned to develop appropriately. She said, "How do you know about the water table, Mr. Fane?" He said the extension data was available through the county GIS system. She said the extension assessment was a private consultation conducted under a research agreement. It is not in the county GIS. He stopped. He started again. She said, "Someone talked to you who should not have, and I would like to know exactly what they told you, because what you know is either more or less than what is accurate, and I need to know which." Fane recovered his professionalism, but not his ease. He told her the partnership was prepared to be flexible on the structure. She told him she was not prepared to sell the library, the property, the water, or the seed to a commercial consolidator who had spent 2 years acquiring the valley in parcels while telling each seller they were the first. She told him she understood what the partnership was, and she understood what he was, and she did not dislike him personally, but she was not interested in making the valley's most important resource in the worst drought in a generation into a commercial advantage for 4 corporations. She told him the library was going to stay in the valley and stay available to the valley's farmers, and the terms would be Harold's terms, which were the terms of a library, which was that you came in, you took what you needed, you brought something back. She told him she thought the meeting was over. He stood for a moment. He said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." She said, "I'm making it exactly as hard as it should be, which is not hard at all if your interest is the valley rather than the extraction." He left. She did not watch him go. She was already writing in the notebook. The community meeting was called for the 2nd Thursday in May, at the Grange Hall, ostensibly as a drought response planning session organized by the County Extension Office, but in practice it was the gathering everyone knew it was, which was the conversation about seeds that had been building since April, now unavoidable. 51 people came. The room smelled of coffee and cut grass and the particular tension of a community that has been frightened long enough to become honest. Delia came with Vera on one side, and Pell Dutcher, who had asked to come and whose mother had agreed, on the other, and she sat near the back because she had not organized the meeting and did not feel it was hers to dominate. Broderick Fane was there, near the front, and he had the third man with him, the legal consultant, and they were speaking to the county extension agent in the way people speak to someone they have already spoken to at length in a different room, the body language of a prepared agreement. When the session opened, Fane rose to speak in the first 5 minutes and presented a proposal that the partnership would establish a seed access program for Valley farmers, administered by the partnership using stock they had sourced from a regional seed bank, available on terms that included a first purchase preference for partnership-adjacent properties and a nominal access fee that was described as administrative. The proposal was detailed and printed on paper with a letterhead, which meant it had been prepared before anyone in the room had been consulted. Delia listened and did not speak. Other people spoke with varying degrees of enthusiasm and skepticism. Then Mel Hooper stood up, which surprised the room because Mel Hooper was not a man who surprised rooms. He said, "I want to know why the proposal doesn't mention the Marsh Library, because I think everybody in this room has heard enough to know that the Marsh Library is the seed resource that actually exists in this valley right now, and any proposal that doesn't account for it is either incomplete or dishonest, and I'd like to know which." The room was quiet. Fane said the partnership was aware of the Marsh Properties holdings and had made a generous offer to incorporate them. He said the offer had been declined, which was, of course, the owner's right, but which meant the library was a private resource not available to the community on any structured basis. He said this as a fact of logistics. It was technically accurate and functionally a lie, because the library was already available to the community on a structured basis, which was the basis Delia had been using for 6 weeks, and Mel Hooper said so. He named 4 other farmers who had received seed from the Marsh Library, and the farmers raised their hands, and Fane looked at their raised hands the way a man looks at something he had calculated correctly and still managed to be surprised by. Delia stood up. She was not planning a long statement. She had been keeping the coal banked long enough that the room was ready for what she had to say, which meant she did not need to say very much of it. She said that the Marsh Library had 407 varieties of open-pollinated seed, the majority of them selected over 35 years for performance in Hatchet Creek conditions, including a substantial number selected specifically for low moisture growing over the last 15 years. She said the library was available to any valley farmer on the terms she had been offering, which were a fair price in a normal year or a reduced price in a crisis year, with a seed return agreement at season's end to keep the library growing. She said these were Harold's terms, which she was keeping because they were right. She said the library was not for sale to the partnership or to any consolidator, but that she was open to a formal community arrangement, something like a cooperative stewardship agreement by which the library would be held in trust with a board of valley farmers, administered from the Marsh property, with Delia as the working archivist for as long as she chose to do it. She said this was something Vera Cholodenko had suggested, and that Vera had more to say about how such arrangements had worked in other places and other times, which made Vera, who had not expected to speak, straighten in her seat and nod once in the grave, approving way she nodded when she thought something was correct. Then Delia sat down. She had spoken for 4 minutes. The room held the sound of those 4 minutes for a moment before anyone moved. What happened after that was not dramatic in the way of votes and speeches, but it was decisive in the way of rooms that have been waiting for a clear idea to organize around. Fane said something about structural viability and legal frameworks that nobody listened to with much energy. The county extension agent, who had spent 6 weeks quietly learning about the library through the farmers who had already used it, and who had, it emerged later, been present at Alvarado's water assessment as an unofficial observer, said that the Extension Office would be glad to support a cooperative seed stewardship model and could point to precedents in 4 other counties. A farmer named Gunderson, who had been at the Grange the previous summer, and who had certainly heard Mel Hooper's remarks about Harold's peculiar daughter, stood up and said he thought the cooperative idea was the right one, and asked if Delia would be willing to chair the organizing committee. Several people said yes to this on her behalf. Before she could answer, she said yes. Mel Hooper sat with his cap in his hands again and did not take any notes, but was paying a different kind of attention than he had paid at any point before. Fane left before the meeting ended quietly, with his legal consultant beside him, and the door of the Grange Hall made the sound a door makes when it is not slammed but is closed with a specific pressure that communicates something about the person closing it. Nobody commented on it. The conversation in the room filled the space he had occupied without any apparent difficulty. Outside afterward, in the parking lot at dusk, Vera stood beside Delia and looked at the sky, which was still dry, but was doing something in the west that might, in a few days, become otherwise. Vera said, "Your father always said the land knows before the calendar knows." She said, "I think he meant it the way I understood it, which is that the land does not need to hurry because it already knows the end of the story. It only needs the gardener to hold on long enough to be present for it." She said it in her accented, deliberate cadence, the way she said everything that mattered, translating from a place where these things had been understood for a long time, and written not in notebooks, but in the bodies of plants and in the hands of people who saved them. The rain came in the 3rd week of May, modest and real, a soaking rain that fell for 2 days and stopped and then returned for another day, the kind of rain that does not fix everything, but tells the ground that fixing has begun. Pell Dutcher stood in the garden in it, with his face up, which was the most dramatic thing Delia had ever seen him do, and then he went to check on the red calypso beans because he was, above all things, a practical person. The creek came up 4 inches. The partnership's north parcel wells began drawing cleaner water. The valley did not heal all at once, because valleys do not, but it began the slow accretion of recovery. That is what healing looks like when you are watching it from inside rather than from a distance. The Hatchet Creek Seed Library Cooperative was formally established in June with 7 founding members, a rotating stewardship board, a nominal annual membership fee, and a seed return covenant that every member signed. Delia was named the library's first archivist, which was the word they all settled on, and which she preferred to director or manager or any word that implied the job was about the person rather than the collection. She continued to live in Harold's house and work in Harold's shop. The room at the back was unlocked now by policy and by intention, and the door stood open on its hinge during library hours, which were Tuesday and Thursday afternoons and Saturday mornings, and which Pell Dutcher attended reliably, first as a volunteer and eventually, years later, as a junior steward with his own set of keys. On the day the cooperative held its first public seed swap, Vera came and sat in a chair near the door of the locked room, now open, and watched people come and go with paper bags and small labeled envelopes, and she said to Delia quietly, as one fact among many, "The seed is not the thing that grows. It is the memory of the thing that survived, and the gardener who keeps the memory is not keeping the past. She is keeping the future from forgetting where it came from." Delia wrote it at the front of a new composition notebook on the first page, in the careful block print she had learned from reading Harold's handwriting for so long that it had migrated into her own. She wrote it the way Harold would have written it, which was carefully and only once, and in a place she would not lose it. The assessor never came back to revise his number. Nobody asked him to. The library was not, in the end, a number. It was what the locked room had been holding all along, which was the valley's future, in the most literal sense available, sealed in glass and labeled in block print, and kept at the right temperature by a man who had understood, without needing to explain it to anyone, that the things worth most are often the things that look to a casual eye like nothing more than storage.